Testing, testing.
It's the Willy Show.
Starting in 5,
4, 3, 2, 1.
So, hello and welcome back to the Willy Show. This is episode, number 21, I believe. I probably should have written that down before I jumped in. But I'm here with a friend of mine, someone who's made my day, made a really proud moment in my life, Dr. Joe Lukins. And welcome, Joe, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely any time. Now, if you remember, anyone who's followed me for a while, I've done a podcast before on 25 Stay Alive with Joe before I branched into my own show. Now, the reason I've got Joe on, and we would have been earlier, but she's been waiting on me to finally read her book. Her book is called The Elite, to think like an athlete and succeed like a champion. And although I think almost the title almost is a little bit misleading, because it's not only if you're an athlete to be a champion, it's more just to improve, I guess, almost day to day, just to perform better at your tasks in life, Joe.
It is. And it's interesting because I actually didn't write the book with athletes in mind when I first decided to write it. What I actually wanted to do is, as you said, translate what do we know about athletes and what have I learned. You know, I've been fortunate enough to learn through my career about working with elite athletes. What are some of the things that I think they've worked out that makes them successful, and how can you then translate that just in a sensible, simple way that anyone can pick it up? And then it's really about us all being the best version of ourselves. So it's not necessarily about us all being elite and standing on a dais and, you know, getting the trophy and the flowers at the end of it all. But it's really about, if you want to be the best that you can be, what are some of the things, what are the tips and tricks that we learn from the elite, and how can we develop that in our own lives?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you go over that fairly in depth in the book, but there's also some confronting bits in it where it's almost a textbook in some ways, where you'll have questions with blank bits that you need to fill out in the book and then come back to later on. And some of them can be a bit confronting. You do mention in the book sometimes it is very hard to judge yourself and what you're not good at. And you go over it in the book about how you went to a convention with other psychologists when you're struggling with a patient, and then you actually, one of the exercises was then to sort of judge yourself back to the psychologist of what you don't do correctly. And I know I struggled a little bit on some of those questions of like actually finding things, being like actually accepting that, oh shit, I actually don't do that very well.
Yeah, it was, I still remember that seminar vividly, because I did, as you said, I went to this workshop. I had a client that I was struggling with. You know, we weren't making any progress, and I think that the seminar was called, you know, Dealing with Difficult Patients or something. And I thought, perfect, it's going to give me all the answers and I can get this person sorted out. And what actually happened through the course of the workshop is, what it did was it sorted me out. You know, that we as a group of psychologists all sat together around in a circle, and the first thing they said is, be your patient and complain about the psychologist. And it was really interesting to watch a group of psychologists doing that, because we were all peers at the time. And at first, everyone was kind of a little bit tiptoeing around it, weren't really being honest and so forth. And I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I had a big whinge about myself. And it was interesting, because when I did that, I realized actually the problem wasn't the client. The client was me. I wasn't setting it up. And I have this mantra I always use, you know, we teach people how to treat us. And the reason the sessions weren't progressing was because I was getting in the way. So it was, yeah, like you say, sometimes it's a real challenge to hold the mirror up to yourself and go, how could I be doing this better? How am I sabotaging my own life? What am I doing that's getting in the way? But unless you can be honest with yourself and really look in the mirror, you're really not going to make the gains that you could make if you do that.
And I guess part of looking in the mirror and finding out what you don't do well, but that can actually really find in yourself what you do well. So it can be, well, I don't do this, and this well, but I'm really good at these other things. So you really identify your strengths and weaknesses, and you can learn where to put more effort and then what to excel at.
That's right. So you can work out the points where you can accelerate yourself, exactly as you said. You can work out where the areas are where there's considerable room for improvement. And I guess then the decision is, do I go with the strengths and keep building on those? Do I build on the weaknesses? You know, what do I want to do? And it really gives you that option then to do either of those things. You can, you know, improve sort of from the bottom up, or you can continue to excel with the skills that you have. And I think that's one of the things I've learnt through my career, because I've been doing this for a while now, that, you know, I've actually chosen, there's plenty of areas where I've chosen just to keep going and to keep working on. And there's other things I've left behind. And I've just, until I could accept that I was going to leave those things behind, I was never going to move on.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that a lot of people deal with. And I know I personally have, of sort of moving on from dreams and aspirations that at some points were very massive in your life. You know, and you do talk about the book that we can't have it all, that you need to, and I think most people have seen the example, or they can look it up on YouTube, of getting like a jar and putting stones in it, that there's big things in your life, but they won't all fit. That you do need to decide what's important and what you're going to go for in your life, that you can't have it all. And I think I've gone through that myself with a lot of things in my life, especially recently with my diagnosis and whatever. You know, there were things I'd put so much effort into, so much training into, that will not ever sort of prosper into something, but to sort of enjoy the ride along that came with that. And I think the best example for me was I joined the army always with the aspiration to go into the special forces. And I trained pretty much my whole, you know, start of my career for that. That was my goal with everything I did, not only career-wise, but lifestyle-wise. And with this diagnosis, with, you know, my medical, everything, that won't become, well, it's not a possibility anymore. It's not even, it wouldn't matter what work I put in. It's not a thing. And I think dealing with that, it's not failure. It's just a change of where your effort's going to, can be really a loose end for some people.
It can be. And I think it's also important as you travel through that journey, and you know, you, Matt, will have gone through lots in coming to that realization, is knowing that sometimes when we leave a goal behind, there might be a grief response to that. Or there might be, and, you know, moving towards an acceptance that this is what it's going to be, and now it gets to be something different. And I think acceptance is one of those things in our lives right across everything that we do, that, you know, you don't move forward unless you have acceptance of your situation. So at the point that you can say, okay, so my goal at this point was this, now it's this, and then you can sort of divert and change tracks. That's what allows you to do that.
Yeah, and it's not a very easy thing to do. And I think a lot of athletes, I talked to a group of footballers recently, really young guys, really 18, 19-year-olds, and some really were struggling with, they had injuries that were putting them out of the season. And they didn't really have the tools to deal with that, because it was like, I don't know how to accept this failure. And it's not failure, it's just a change of sort of wave, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And injury is certainly one of those things, with using that as an example, that can, you know, really pulls you up short, because the challenge with an injury is once it's happened, you can't change it. You know, it is what it is, and you've got to deal with the recovery time, whatever that might be, and whatever that might then mean for you in terms of your sport, and particularly for professional athletes. If it ends your season, if it ends your career, and if so much of your purpose is built in around that, it's like, well, who am I now? You know, that particularly for a professional athlete, that's a big part of their identity. And you know, obviously in defence as well, you know, it's such a physical occupation that if injury comes along and makes changes for you and limits what you can or can't do, and it changes your identity, you've got a whole heap of stuff there to sort of work your head around to, before you're ready to, you know, get back up out of bed and get on with whatever it's going to be next.
Yeah, and I think that changing of identity is very hard, because the reason you're creating that identity in the first place is that's who you wanted to be, where you wanted to end up, yet some external force is making that not possible. And it's like the identity you're becoming isn't what you originally wanted. And I think that was the hardest thing for me, is, well, I still want that goal. Like, you know, in my heart of hearts, you know, training and going through the selection and everything for that is still what I want. And no matter how far it is, it's still what I want. But coming to terms, like, I've accepted it's not a possibility, but changing that identity is still, I think at some points, almost impossible. I think if you went and asked a Formula One driver when they're 85 years old, they would still say, I want to get in a car and win the world championship, but I'm never going to.
Yeah. And it is, isn't it? It's hard to come to terms with that. And I've certainly seen plenty of people post-career or for whatever reason, something's come along that's either they've chosen to change path, or more often than not, the path has been changed for them by some sort of external force or something that's happening for them, like you say, like an injury or an illness and a diagnosis. And I can think of one in particular who hasn't been in their domain for 20 years and still says, I can feel what it's like to be back there, and I just want that feeling again, so it's even hard to put into words what that actually is. But I agree. I think that coming to terms with your identity, and does that ever get completely resolved? Maybe in some ways it doesn't.
Yeah, and I guess that fire still burns for people, but I think it's so easy to fall into the trap, I guess, of being a victim and that victimhood mindset that, you may be a victim of, a bung knee, an ACL tear, or to my extent, you've got a brain tumor. But I think it's hard to not play into that too much, because some of it you can't affect, and being a victim doesn't actually help at all.
No, it doesn't. And I think one of the questions, and I know you've heard me say this before, one of the questions I like to overlay over a circumstance that you don't like, that you didn't want, that you didn't invite into your life, or whatever it might be, is to overlay that question of, okay, so given this is my circumstance, what now is most helpful? Because certainly if in the field that I come from, which is positive psychology, the science is overwhelming that one of the most beneficial mindsets that we can have is one that's optimistic. That when we can think about the world in a way that every cloud has a silver lining, the research in every domain of life is very clear that that's what's helpful for you in terms of success, and in contradiction to that, when you walk through life with the view that every silver lining has a cloud, the Eeyores of the world, the pessimism, that doesn't help. And that's all true and that's all fine. But what I find is that when you have a life circumstance that comes along and smacks you in the head and says, well, here, have this, there are some circumstances, there are many circumstances where putting on the optimistic boots just doesn't feel true. It doesn't ring true. So, and whether it be something like for yourself, whether it be, I'm based in Townsville, where we went through the floods earlier this year and people lost their homes and their businesses, and there's still people out of their homes. So if you go around to those people and say, well, just be optimistic, I wouldn't like to see the reaction I'm going to get to that. It would be an insensitive thing to say. But, what you can do at that point in time when life deals you a curveball is to perhaps go, okay, so given this circumstance, now what is most helpful is sometimes a better question to ask, because it seems more real and it doesn't get you caught up in that idea that you're supposed to be positive and happy and, about a circumstance that isn't that great.
Yeah, and it's funny when you say, what is most helpful for a situation. And I think I can't really think of a circumstance where optimism also wouldn't be a slight answer to that helpful. That, everything from, what happened to myself to the floods in Townsville, that, what's happened is terrible. Imagine you've lost your home. But if you look at, what's most helpful, I may not be able to tell you what is the most helpful, but I can tell you what's not helpful. And sitting there pessimistic, feeling sorry for yourself, definitely isn't the answer. It's definitely not helpful. In most scenarios, or pretty much any scenario, there is time to grieve. But at some point, being pessimistic doesn't help you at all.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with that more, that we know pessimism is unhelpful, because pessimism becomes a feeling. It just drags us through the mud, and it really isn't a good way for us moving forward. And like you say, it just slots you straight into that victim mentality, which again is another thing that will be unhelpful for us in terms of how we travel through life.
Yeah, I say again and again this victimhood, and I think to some extent a lot of the things out there at the moment, say like the "Are You Okay" movement, which of course is it is a fantastic movement, but I think it almost in some respects makes victimhood, it almost normalizes it by it's okay not to be okay. And it almost normalizes that living at that not okay is fine, and you can continue there, and treating you as a victim for the rest of your life is fine. Where the way I look at it is, well, yeah, everyone knows it's okay not to be okay. That's a given. But at some point, unless you stay as a victim, you actually need to get better or seek improvement at some point.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well, that I think that it's important for all of us that when we have those moments where we're down to feel that way. There's no point in saying to someone, don't feel the way that you're feeling if that's what you're feeling. But I agree is that you don't want that then to become everything for you. And I think that if I think of it in terms of my profession, that's where psychology tried to shift its thinking. That psychology for hundreds of years, was the science of understanding, dysfunction and disease and people who were struggling, and tried to understand what that looks like, how can we help people, what are treatments and so forth, which is all incredibly important. And then, in the 80s, there was a professor by the name of Donald Clift, and he said, well, what would happen if we studied what's right with people? And that's where the psychology kind of had its aha moment and went, oh yeah, we haven't really explored that as fully as we could, and we certainly haven't done it as an organised science. So what positive psychology tries to do is it's essentially the science of what goes well. And again, learning to be, that's one of the reasons that resilience is a topic that we hear so much of now, is because what psychologists used to look at was stress management. How do you manage your stress? And you know what? You don't, because it's there and it's what happens. But what happens for humans is stuff goes wrong. And then how do you bend and not break? How do you bounce back? And how do you even bounce forward, which is often spoken of? So like you say, how do you dust yourself off when something goes pear-shaped, but then get up and then get going and then improve and strong and be wiser for the experience, So there's lots of ways to travel through an adversity and then grow from it, and then to find some form of light that comes through from it, which I think is consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think adversity is one of those things in life that can make you grow so much. I like to think I went through one of the most adverse things in my life of, brain tumor, brain cancer, everything. But honestly, and I say this again and again to people, that in many, or I say to them, other than dying, brain cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm better from it. That, I know my life, like if you forget all the life-shortening aspects, but as far as the person I am, the way I view life, the way I treat people, and also the success I've had, I guess, to a degree of having a forum to tell my story and sort of everything I've done, that adversity, which initially I thought was the worst thing to ever happen to me, actually has been in many ways, one of the best things to ever happen to me.
And I mean, there's so much wisdom that comes from that, isn't it? That you've travelled through that and now have that way of viewing the world and understanding that. So, and I've heard you talk about that in many different ways through, some of the other podcasts and so forth. And it's a wonderful way to view it, and it's helpful. It's helpful.
Well, that's honestly what all these are trying to do is help people. I see a lot of people with significantly worse mental health and mental outcomes than myself. With, now, on my bit of bias, I'm like, well, you haven't gone through as much as I guess I have. And I know people have different reactions to everything, but I'm like, I think if you had the proper tools, you could really succeed with this. I've seen the downfall of some people over some very little stuff. Yes, it's compiling, but I see, especially in my generation or even younger, the levels of anxiety, depression and everything. And I'm like, and the level of suicide, which keeps rising and rising. Yet society is becoming easier and easier to live in, and especially Australians, we're so lucky for anything. If you have a roof over your head, you're in the 1% of the world, literally. And that's honestly all these are trying to do. But you mentioned that positive psychology is more looking at what's going right in your life. And in part of your book, you do mention about it's important to see a psychologist actually when things are going well, is just as important, or if not more important, than when things are going downhill. And why is that? Is that So it's easier to identify what's good in your life, or?
Look, I do think it's a really valuable thing to do. I'm not just trying to conjure up more business for psychologists out there by saying go and see a psychologist when things are going well. But that's not a bad consequence of this either, for the psychologist, I guess. But look, the reason that I say that, and I guess that's particularly come from my experience with working with athletes, is that so typically what I saw in my work as a psychologist was that people would come when things weren't working so well. They would come in and they would say, "Joe, these are my circumstances. This is what I'm not happy with, or this is what's not working for me, or this is what's making me feel sad. Help me get back to where I was." And one of the things that's really interesting when you work with athletes is even sports psychology itself has changed as a discipline and a field, where athletes used to expect that you would go and see the psych when things weren't going well. You're playing badly, you break up with someone, you're drinking too much, or, stuff's going wrong. But the really great athletes are the ones who know that their sport is as much a mental pursuit as a physical one. And that if you know that when you are at your peak in your sport or whatever it is that you're doing, and there's particular things that you're doing that's contributing to making that happen, like it doesn't happen by accident. So you are doing deliberate things that are making you perform well. Why wouldn't you want that insight as to what those things are? And isn't it easier to see them when you're in the middle of doing it rather than sitting there feeling miserable going, yeah, I can remember what it used to be like. So I spend a lot of time with athletes getting them to explore, when you're playing well, what does that look like? You're playing well now. What are you doing in the week leading up to a home game, an away game? What are you doing as part of your training? What are you doing away from your sport? And that's something we can all do. So if for anyone who's listening whose life is traveling well at the moment, that's awesome. So get a piece of paper out, jot down some notes, and what are some of the things, what are your little things that you're doing? I often refer to it as, your recipe. What are all the ingredients that make up the recipe for you that makes life come good for you to turn out well? Because those are the things you need to keep doing. And so many times with athletes, I've done that. When I know they're performing well, I'll pull them aside for a little while and just say, tell me a bit about what's happening for you right now. And I'll furiously write down notes. And then if they come back to me down the track and go, well, it's not working so well at the moment, we'll get the list out and go, well, what are you leaving out of the recipe? It's literally that straightforward. But we tend to, when things are going well, we take it for granted. And you talked before about gratitude. And so I think when we're grateful for the things that are going well and we're mindful and we understand what those things are, then we're much better placed to keep doing them.
Yeah, it's a funny one with that, with, getting athletes as things are going well. Do you find with athletes, and I know there's a lot of examples of this throughout society and also, and definitely during the army, of athletes who have always excelled younger, struggling more as they get into more professional sport, and then finally will come last, or they will have a bit of a failure or a loss, that they struggle more. And a bit of the old an A grade student will end up working for a C grade student, because that C grade student really knows how to work and he knows how to accept failure and move forward. And although I've never done a special forces selection, it's a very sort of well-known thing, I guess, amongst a lot of guys, that a lot of the fittest guys there, that for the first few days, they're at the front of the pack on the runs and they're leading this, and they've always been the fittest of the unit and everything. But once everyone's at the same baseline and they start coming lower down the pack and they don't know how to accept that failure, they've never done that. They've never been the slowest guy, and they struggle with that. Do you see that in sort of childhood prodigies who move up into professional sport?
You do, because what you see is what happens, that talent often isn't enough. So those that get there on the raw ability, and you particularly see that actually, as you mentioned, with those younger athletes, the junior athletes who got through because they were just big kids, or they were the fast kids, or they could just, they had that ability when they were younger. And sometimes having that talent can get in the way of learning the really critical thing, which is part of elite sport, which is effort. That if you don't know how to work hard, and if you don't know how, you raise such an important point there. If you don't know how to cope with a loss, then you're never going to get anywhere, particularly in elite sport. And like you say, with special forces, that, you know, it doesn't all go perfectly well. And it's not so much what happens to us, but it's how we deal with it. So, you know, it's one of the tough lessons for me. I'm a parent. I've got 2 teenage sons. And you never want to see your kids, you know, lose or get hurt or any of those sorts of things when they're out there doing stuff. But what you've got to remind yourself as a parent when they do is that's when they're learning the lessons. You don't learn much when you're winning. You know, you tend to take it for granted. You don't spend a lot of time focusing on it. But you get dusted up in a game, you know, and if there's an awesome learning opportunity for you. So if you don't learn the lessons that are there, well, you're just going to keep learning the lessons anyway. You know, life's going to keep giving you an opportunity to learn them, is my experience with that. But I do think that it's that hard work. And I've certainly worked with elite level athletes. One in particular comes to mind, who's about my vintage. And I remember him saying when he was a younger athlete that he wasn't the best. That if you lined up all the other guys, and he was a football player, and he said, you know, you line up all the guys who play footy, there's oodles more talent out there than what I've got. He said, but you know what? I know how to work hard. And that's why I'm here. And I've never taken that for granted. I'm just going to keep plugging away, keep working hard. And that was an athlete who was able to be very successful at a national level for many years.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is one of those things, working hard for things. But I guess at some point in sport, the physical advantages some athletes have over others could never be overridden purely by hard work.
No.
I think a lot of examples that come out of an amazing athlete, Michael Jordan playing basketball, who is just an incredible athlete. But the way I sort of look at it is, yes, he worked hard. No one has ever, you know, denied that. But he himself has said, I definitely wasn't the hardest worker out there. And even like say myself, no matter how hard I worked, I could never be a professional basketballer. That the physical advantage of someone like him, that he's got hands the size of my head, that I just couldn't be there. And how does that look for someone, you know, say I was a junior basketballer, and it's like, well, we know, Matt, but sometimes in sport like this, no matter how hard you work, it's just you're never going to have it.
Yeah. And certainly there's many sports where there are physical parameters that you are just simply, you know, if you chose your parents well, then, you know, you end up with a body that equips you to play a particular sport or to participate in a particular sport. Or like you say, you know, we often talk about, you know, some of the swimmers, the size of their feet. You know, if you're swimming up against someone who's basically got fins on the end of their legs, then, you know, they're always going to have that advantage. And I guess you're right that the reality is that some very good athletes don't work as hard. And I know of athletes who, you know, you describe them that way, that perhaps they get into the gym and they don't put in the effort of someone alongside them, and they still, you know, do perform really well in the game or whatever it is. And I guess Jordan's a good example. You know, you raised him as an athlete that, you know, what he was able to really do well was overcome adversity at a young age, because that's when he got his knockback, that he actually at that stage wasn't the right physical parameters for the team, and he got cut and he didn't get that opportunity. Now, how many people at that point would go, oh, well, there goes that idea, that sucks, you know, but, you know, he was able to just keep persevering, and then his body caught up with what he needed, you know, in terms of physicality to be able to then go on and become the incredible champion that he was.
Yeah, and there are examples in sport very similarly to him, particularly with some AFL footballers who may not have had the physical ability to be, you know, a top AFL footy player, but then they've sort of, I guess they've looked at their strengths and have actually moved across into the American NFL or other sports similarly. That, and I guess that's sort of what someone like you would do, is will identify your strengths. And they, you know, I'm not the biggest, I don't know that much about footy, but they might say, like, look, I'm a really good runner and I'm heavier, but I'm almost too big and heavy for AFL. And he's identified those strengths and, well, actually you'd be a perfect fit over here, although it wasn't the original path you've set out on, a slight push in the right direction. And there's some AFL players who are some of the best in the world in the American NFL.
Mm, that's right, and I think that's one of the things that when we look at sports science and when we look at something like exercise physiology, there's a whole range of research and parameters around talent identification, where athletes get picked on their physicality
Mm.
before they've even ventured into the sport. That they might be a gymnast, but then they might find themselves becoming an aerial skier, as an example of that they wouldn't have necessarily picked that sport, but just on the basis of some of their capabilities or something about, their actual physical dynamics. There's something about them that goes, well, look, you'd be really well suited to this. So let's see how you go with it. And that's, and that again comes back to, as I said before, if you chose your parents well done. And you can move into whatever that's going to be.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. With that, yeah, of course, hard work will always make you better. To judging yourself off yourself yesterday is more healthy, I think, than judging yourself sort of peer reviewed. It is, of course, very important to peer review yourself in any competitive, sort of world, whether it be business, education, sport. But it's also incredibly important to look back at where you were yesterday or the day before to where you are now and where that hard work has taken you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that personal benchmark is probably the one that you have most control over too. So you can really, measure yourself up against, like you said, where you were yesterday, where you were a year ago. And we do know, social comparison obviously is a necessary part of, you go for promotion, and if there's only 2 promotion spots and 6 of you go for it, then they're going to compare you across each other and make those comparisons to see who's the best. I think there's lots of times in our lives, though, where we do get caught up in the social comparison, and it does us no favours. And one of the most evident of those, actually, which might be taking us off on a tangent, but is social media.
I just jotted down Instagram then.
Yeah, absolutely. That if you look at a lot of those different flavours of social media, it's people's highlight reels. Here I am on my holiday in blah, blah, and here I am having this fabulous meal, and you're at home eating Vegemite toast for dinner or whatever it is. And we know that most people the majority of people come off social media feeling worse than when they went on it. So being really mindful of social media and the effects of it. And some of the more recent research, we're only tip of the iceberg in terms of the research in the social media domain because it's so relatively new in terms of the science. But there's all sorts of research coming through. And one that I found interesting, I was reading the other day, is we do know that there's negative effects for people being on social media. People often feel worse when they come off it. But it seems that people feel even worse if they're on social media but not participating in it. So if you're the voyeur who just scrolls and scrolls and scrolls and looks at stuff, but you never like stuff, interact, you don't use it as a social tool, it's kind of almost like being at the party, standing in the corner watching and not participating. That seems to be worse than going up and striking a conversation. So that's it. That was an interesting finding. I was reading about that the other day. So we'll see where some of this social media research takes us, and our understandings. But there's no doubt in terms of social comparison, we know that if you base your self-worth on what everyone else is doing around you, and that's the majority of the thing that you do, you're not going to fare well out of it at all.
Yeah, and I think the influence of social media on people is massive, that people literally will take a trip overseas to take photos of them in front of the Eiffel Tower for Instagram. And I think one of the more interesting things, and this goes into sort of the research for social media, is people living now, you, me, everyone, are the only humans to ever exist where we can be judged off a number. Like literally you can I can go onto your account and look at, Joe has this many likes and I have this many and this person has this money, and you can make an Excel spreadsheet of how popular you are in society, and instinctively you judge yourself off that and judge others off that. And I think it's a weird thing that humans haven't got a grasp on because we've never done it. It's never been there. We've looked at people who, earn this and earn that, but it's never been as blatant in our face of this person has more likes than me. And it's a really funny one. I know Instagram's recently got rid of like the like counter. You can't see them. And I have a sort of a mixed opinion on that. I like the idea of, the mental health aspect of that you can't just straight up be like, oh, this person's this amount of popular and I'm this amount of popular. But I also have another view on it, and I'll sort of ask your opinion on this, that we're almost sheltering people a bit much of, well, there are going to be people more popular than you, and there's people less popular than you. And it's one of those, you have to, it's at some point, for want of a better word, man up. And, well, yeah, this person does have this life and they have this money and this car. And it's almost that competition's almost taken out of it with removing that feature. Like, I agree with the removal of it, but I sometimes think we over-shelter people.
I think you're right. I think we do protect people from themselves to our own detriment. You know, we don't learn those skills of resilience that, you know, and if you go back to the playground days before, thankfully, we had all the social media, but you knew when you went to school that, you know, one person was more popular than the others, they had more friends and so forth. We didn't have the raw data that we now have, like you said, where you could actually, if your life was so inclined, you could, you know, set up that spreadsheet, like you say, and you could look at all those sorts of things, or have some sort of inherent knowledge of where you sit in the pecking order, if you want to call it that as well. Are you coming to the top of the feed and so forth? But I agree. I think our ability to bounce back and to understand that we're not all the same and it is different and we've all got our strengths, and what are they? I agree with you. You know, I don't have an issue that those likes came off, but I do think that resilience is something that has waned across us as a community, and there's, you know, we just see too much of, you know, and I think it came through as a generational change of, you know, a well-intentioned parenting idea from, you know, sort of to a generation ago, essentially, where we understood in the 80s that that people tend to do well when their self-esteem is robust and they're feeling good about themselves. And that's true. When people feel good about themselves, they tend to perform well. And then it got a little bit misguided because the thinking was, well, then it's really about enhancing people's self-esteem, and how are we going to do that? Oh, I know. We'll give Jo a ribbon every time she goes in a running race, and we'll get it across the stage 6 times a year for school, and everyone's a winner and all those sorts of things. And then you end up with a whole generation of kids who think they're above average. You know, and it doesn't work for the whole cohort to be above average, because then nobody copes when you're not, and we lose those skills. I mean, I was saying it before, you know, it's not a bad thing when we're unsuccessful, because that's when we really learn things about ourselves and our capabilities, and we can grow and we can improve. Whereas if we get a ribbon every single time, then the value of the ribbon diminishes. So we have to be careful with that we aren't, you know, protecting people to the point that we're surrounding them in bubble wrap and not giving them skills and strategies to cope with the reality of the world.
Yeah, well, that actually was going to be my next question. I have written down about handing out a trophy or ribbon to every single kid at sporting events of this generation. That, I know my opinion on it, which has very little scientific backing, but is almost softening the generation to, well, no, everyone's a winner. Well, no. And it sort of links back in with what we were saying before about those athletes who are elite at a young age. Once they deal with failure, they've never dealt with it before at any level, so that it's catastrophic to them. And my sort of fear on it, to a degree, is the whole generation has been, you know, everyone's equal, you know, there's no winners, no losers, that these young kids have never dealt with small losses, or you lost at footy, or you lost in this running race, that when they get into, so to speak, the real world, that they go for that job interview and they don't get it. And, you know, not both of them get the job, one of them does. And then it, instead of being a small loss and getting back on your feet, dusting yourself off and getting back into it, it becomes a catastrophic failure for them, because they haven't had those small little losses to then strengthen the muscle, or your brain as a muscle, to deal with those big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree with that more, that it's those opportunities for us. I do think it does soften a whole generation by not allowing people to recognize that, you know, sometimes people win, sometimes people don't. So I'm all for, I think you want to encourage effort with kids. So if it was a cross country, then I think everyone who goes in it should get a point for their house to contribute. And I think 3 kids should get ribbons,
Yeah.
first, second and third, and so if you come fourth, filthy fourth, then, because what you sometimes see, and I've seen it at some of the schools, they might have 6 heats and they give out 6 first places, 1 for each heat. And then what I've actually seen kids do is go, well, I don't want to be in heat 1. I want to be in heat 2 because I'm a better chance of winning it and getting a blue ribbon rather, and you start to see people missing the point that it's about, working towards being your best, and you're not going to be your best if you're sabotaging yourself to win a ribbon, So I think encouraging effort is incredibly important, because I think our self-esteem is better enhanced when you reinforce effort. If you were my tennis coach, and I'm a dreadful tennis player, so if you were my tennis coach and you only encouraged me when I hit a good shot, then, pour yourself a beer, sit back and, wait, because I'm not going to do too much out there. You're not going to have to do much work as my coach. But if you as my coach encourage me when I try my best, and you can give me a bit of reinforcement around that, then I'll keep trying, because, that I can control my effort. I can't control my ability. So I can do things to work towards improving my ability, but effort is the bit that I control. And that's what we want. We want kids that can try hard even after they failed. We want adults that can do that. Like you said, you go for the job interview, you don't get it. So then you rework your application and you apply somewhere else, and with your history in defence, you see lots of opportunities to fail, so, it's really about how you cope with that and then how you move forward.
Yeah, and you do learn so much more about yourself in failure than in success.
You do.
Not only in failure, in hard times, in adversity towards things.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'm seeing coming into sport, from my little knowledge of it, well, to a degree, but more from my interest in psychology in sport, if I can talk, is this merging of genders in sport going into, I'm actually thinking, well, is it going to end up really degrading to women in the sport? An example of this I've seen recently is there was a powerlifting, weightlifting competition. And in the females division, the top 3 were actually genetic males. And I almost think is this really degrading to their sport, thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to win my class? That, instead of it being an equal competition, it's far outweighed, and that this isn't important anymore.
Yeah, the topic of gender in sport has become a very complex one, as you say, because, and I guess what it is sport, from where I sit, is a microcosm of life. Everything that we see playing out in life, we see it played out through sport. And what we've seen, particularly in recent times, or cast the net back as far as you like, but our understanding of gender, the options that people have in terms of being who they are and living the lives that they are and being true to themselves, has meant lots of changes for people. And I don't think sport's caught up. I don't think sport fully knows how to handle this kind of situation, this changes, when people are having surgery, when people are having, changes within their bodies and so forth. And so sport really hasn't got the answers yet onto how to best cater to all the different types of people that are out there and how they are living their lives. So I think we've hit an interesting time where I really don't think we're where we're going to end up. I think we're going to see a lot more change within sport, but it will be interesting to see over time where this heads to.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one. And I think, what I hope it doesn't do is push biological genetic females out of sport, because I believe that it is incredibly important to have both men and women playing sport and everyone playing sport. But at a competitive level across 99% of sports, you will see genetic advantages of men. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. But I think it's incredibly important that we keep sort of true to, well, we need at least classes for people. And however that looks and however the sport's evolving, that'll be. Sort of what I want to move into, because that's more of an opinion-based than psychology or psychological. But one of the ones that I want to sort of touch on that I wrote down very early on, reading through your book, is the difference in how men and women approach sport, and why in some sports where there is no physical advantage, say, and this actually I was watching a thing the other day about race car drivers. There's now no reason that the pack of drivers shouldn't be, at least physically, shouldn't be 50% men, 50% women. Yet, if you see a race car driver, it might be 95.5%. It may be more swayed in men's direction. And I know there might be a lot of social constructs as far as, well, young boys are more likely to be pushed into a go-kart. But I want to sort of look at is there a psychological difference of how men and women will approach a sport like that? Like, are men more likely to be more aggressive behind the wheel of a car, or is there a difference in that aspect, not a physical one?
From what I've seen and from what I've read, I think there's, every reason why a woman could be behind the wheel.
Oh, I agree.
Participating in those sports. And I think, like you mentioned, is that historically the reason that we've seen those sort of gender divisions around some of the sports has been about opportunity and expectations. And I think it's probably more of a sociological argument, or an opportunity-based argument. So I think that's probably been more the case historically. And I think what we're starting to see now, changes in opportunity within sports, and whether it be starting to see more female referees, for example, in some of the footballs and so forth. And as long as the athletes are out there, and your referees are most definitely athletes, as long as they're physically capable of keeping up with the pace of the game or whatever it is that they're doing, then I think we're going to see more of that. And I think that will be good for sport.
Yeah, of course. I'm more touching on, is there a difference in how men and women approach their training and their sport at an elite level?
From what I've seen, I don't think so. I think that when I think of, and so if we contrast two sports that I've worked very closely with over the years, so I've worked for the last 23 years with an NRL team, and I've worked for the last 6 years with a WNBL team, which is the Women's National Basketball League. When I think across the athletes that I've worked with in both of those sports, and if you were just to describe the characteristics or the psychological characteristics of some of those athletes, they are the same. I think that that I don't think that that's gender specific in terms of what you see across athletes. So I actually think that you're just as likely to see those characteristics across male athletes and female athletes.
Yeah, and I think the rise of and I think it's a good thing, the rise of televised, more televised women's sport and everything has made it not a secondary sport, that it's its own standalone equal sport, that the women's AFL isn't a secondary to the AFL. It's its own league. It's its own professionalism. And I think that's a great thing for sport, for everyone, that it's not run in conjunction. It's its own entity now.
Yeah, as a standalone sport, I would agree. And I think particularly with the AFL, they've done a fantastic job in promoting that. And we've seen that across a number of the different sports, particularly here in Australia in the last couple of years, that there's been some really sensible programs and processes put in place. It's provided opportunity. The sponsors are getting on board, and the crowds are wanting to support it as well. So I think it's a pretty exciting time in Australian sport, giving opportunity for us to see lots of great athletes out there participating in whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, it is a funny one. And I know personally, I wouldn't want to see it merged into a unisex competition and it being just a flat line of sport. I think it is important to have that difference. But that's more of a personal thing.
Yeah, and I think for many of the sports, physiologically, you need to keep them separate. You know, in terms of, like you were saying before, that when there are genuine physiological differences, and if you like the playing field isn't level, then why would you keep it level? So having those separate opportunities in the sport is a sensible thing moving forward.
Yeah. The equality of opportunity is incredibly important, even if the outcome is not the same.
Yes.
And I think if you're bumping up some people and pushing others down in any aspect, whether it be age, sex, gender, anything, that at some point that is linking back to before, that sort of softening of society, that, oh, no, because, this is the under 12s, but because, Johnny's a bit taller, a bit shorter, he's going to move up and down. Well, no, it's it might be fine at a kid's level, and I'm not saying it's not, but there is some point where, well, no, you're going to lose, and people are going to have an advantage over you at some point.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree.
Now, one of the most interesting things I saw in your book that, and I've heard of before, and it is something it sort of blows my mind, is what's called the Banister Effects. Now, for those of you who don't know, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Banister, he was the first man to run the elusive 4-minute mile. And how, they've been trying to do it since the late 1800s, I think you linked it back to. And it was done in the 1950s or 60s, first run. And once he had run it, that then in that following 12 months, there was like another 20 people do it. And that effect of, and is that coming from that now it's achievable? Where does that come from?
Yeah, that comes from mindset. That is, I think Banister's race gets viewed from so many different angles because it was such a significant moment in sport. At the time it was likened to conquering Everest, cover of Sports Illustrated. Like, it was an incredible feat because the belief at the time, and this is what you're tapping into, is how significant is belief in terms of giving us opportunity, but how does it limit us as well? Because the science at the time was very clear and said it is unlikely that an athlete will be able to run, the mile under 4 minutes. And in fact, there was even some thinking at the time that suggested that for a human to run that fast, their heart would beat so rapidly that it could actually kill them. So it was genuinely considered to be something that was impossible. Now, if we think about some of the things in our life that are impossible, if you know something's impossible, then you're probably not going to waste your time trying to do it. It's that kind of, well, why would you bother? And fortunately for the sporting world, and there were several athletes, vying to do it at that particular time, and Banister was the first one to experience success with it. But I think what really typified Banister, separate from all those people that didn't have a go, and what can we take from that story, is the notion of possibility thinking. What is possible? What if you can run that fast? What if somebody could run a mile under 4 minutes? And what would that take, and how would you do it? And what if I'm that person? That had to be the thinking along the way there. And so as soon as you open yourself to the possibility, and it's a possibility he might have been wrong, he may have tried his whole athletic career and never got there, and there will be some who never got there, but you're certainly not going to be able to do it unless you entertain the possibility that maybe I can. And with all of these risks that athletes might take, you have to be prepared that with every risk, it may fail. It may not happen, and then you've just got to know that you can dust yourself off. So, on the day that he ran it, they'd set up, what are all the parameters for the perfect conditions for this to occur. I think he broke every single one of them. I think it was, the track wasn't right, the conditions weren't right. On the day that he did it, I think it was blowing its backside off. It was windy as anything, and just before he raced, the wind dropped out. He'd been at work that day. He'd gone down at lunchtime and sharpened his spikes on the equipment at work because he was working at the hospital, and went across and was able to break the 4 minute mile. And it was a huge crowd that turned up when he tried it that particular day, and the roar from the crowd apparently was like nothing that anyone had ever heard. So, but it's just such a great example of being open to the possibility, and then as soon as your belief changes, then it does become more plausible. We do limit ourselves so often by what we tell ourselves, and one of my mantras that I'm always talking to people about is, just because I think it doesn't mean that it's true. You know, just because I think that no one can run faster than 4 minutes, that doesn't mean that it's true. So we often limit our own capabilities and opportunities by what we tell ourselves. So being mindful of what you tell yourself, and that this is something that all of us can think about, is, you know, how am I limiting my life? What am I preventing myself from doing? What are my opportunities that I'm not exploring simply because I don't think it's possible? You know, and sometimes we'll be right and sometimes we won't, and that's okay. But you know, I've had a good friend of mine just a month ago ran a marathon. And for a long time, she told herself that she didn't think she'd ever be able to do that. And then for whatever reason, one day she went, hang on, maybe I could. And what do you know? She's just run her first marathon, did it in a very tidy time. And so it was, you know, a great thing for her. But that never would have happened if she hadn't shifted her thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting, that one. And as you said, like, you know, some people don't think it's possible, therefore, or if they can't see that it's possible, they will think it's impossible, even if it's not. I often think that, and one of my personal things that I love that's happened is the moon landings. And there is a lot of conspiracy based around, well, they didn't land on the moon. Now, the evidence for us landing there is massive, and it going ahead. But on the same aspect, I'd like to think anyway, the psychology of people who think that didn't go ahead were the ones that could never have dreamt that is actually possible. That they've never actually had that thinking of, well, no, we can actually do this. That at some point somewhere in NASA, they actually thought, no, this is actually possible. We can do this. We can put a man on that rock. And I think a lot of people who are sort of moon landing deniers are not factual deniers. They're almost dream deniers, that no, we couldn't do that because no one could ever dream that big.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I think what this taps into, if we look at the science, in, you know, the psychology of what's happening here, is one of the things that you'll often read about and see is this notion of having a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. You know, and the fixed mindset is, this is the way that it is and it can't be any different. And the way I often get people to think about it for themselves is to reflect back on their time at school. You know, and I'll use one example, and this will resonate well for some people listening and not so much for others. But, you know, I often say to people, what were you like at maths at school? How'd you go at maths? And it's, you know, it's not uncommon for, you know, you say that to a room full of people and they start smiling and they go, oh, I was terrible at it. You know, I'm no good at maths. And they say things like, I don't have a maths brain. I just can't think that way. Or, you know, and for some people you've got to pose, you know, what were you like at English, or what were you like at art, or whatever it is. And people just go, yeah, no, I just don't think that way. Now, what happens is that when you create a fixed reality for yourself, and whichever one it might be in those two instances, you know, I don't have a maths brain, or I'm not very good at English, or I just don't, you know, I just can't write those essays. If you believe that you have that fixed mindset, if you believe that to be true, then you're hardly likely to then entertain the possibility of getting better at it. You know, oh no, what, you know, if I thought as a kid at school that I wasn't any good at maths, then you certainly don't go and sign up to do statistics or a degree in mathematics or anything like that. So what happens is that those limiting thoughts we pose on ourselves then limits our opportunities as we move through life. Now, maybe you never want to do something with maths, so maybe it doesn't matter. But what we know is that one of the most helpful things we can do, and there's that word again, one of the most helpful things we can do is adopt what we call a growth mindset. And what a growth mindset is, being open to the possibility of improving, of getting better. And so if I can illustrate it very, very simply, all I have to do is add one word. And all I need to say is, I'm not good at maths yet. And it's that yet word that entertains the possibility that maybe one day someone can sit down with me and explain it to me in a way, and I'll you know, work out how to do it. So you know, I think one of the things that's most beneficial for all of us, it's certainly for kids at school, but, you know, we're all on this planet, you know, evolving and growing, that when we can adopt a growth mindset, when we can entertain the possibility, it doesn't guarantee that we're going to end up being great at maths or great at English or whatever it is, but we open ourselves to the possibility that we can do things better. And that's why when you look at, like you said, the thinking at NASA around what if we put someone on the moon, and what are the steps we're going to take to make that happen, or it happens with Banister or any of those kind of situations, you know, that helps everyone in terms of growing and improving.
Yeah, and you go over fairly significantly in your book about changing language and the importance of changing your language. And I'll use your maths example of, instead of me, and I'm shit at maths, but instead of saying I hate maths or I'm terrible at maths, me saying, well, maths challenges me. And it takes it from something I can't do, that I'm not bothering to do, to something that challenges me, and the outlook of that mindset of creating it as a challenge, not as an impossibility.
Absolutely. And what you've tapped into, Matt, there is that incredibly important realization that the way that we think matters, and that the language that we use, you know, whether it be the things that we say out loud to other people. And it was interesting, the second then that you said, I'm shit at maths, I wanted to look through the screen and go, well, but you could be better, you know, you could improve, you know. It's because it is, if we say that we're terrible at something, then to travel down the path to improve is so much harder for ourselves than if we just go, like you say, maths challenges me. And I do think that notion of putting the difficulties of life into the framework of the challenges of life, most people who have a little bit of competitive nature in them will take on a challenge. You know, I don't particularly want to do stuff that's difficult. I worked with an athlete once, and I had a little exercise that I do with athletes sometimes, where I've got a couple of phrases, and I think I've replicated that exercise in the book, where I've got a couple of standard phrases of things that people say to themselves, and I get them to explore how different does it feel when you say it differently. So the difficulty versus challenges is a good example of that, you know. And I had an elite athlete coming through. He was a young athlete who couldn't even believe he was in the same room as the other athletes he was in the team with, let alone, you know, on the team. And the phrasing that he used was, I find it difficult to speak in team meetings. He just went, you know, I'm young, I'm not confident, be stuffed if I'm going to make a mistake in front of everybody else. I find it really, really difficult to speak in front of others. And all I did for him in that meeting was I said, well, what if we change that word difficult? And he sort of said, well, what are you talking about? And I said, what if we said, I find it a challenge to speak in team meetings? And it was interesting because he instantly sat up in his chair, like, you know, went from slouching to his, and he sort of leant forward a little bit. And I thought, right, I've got him here. And you could see the light bulb go on as we were having the conversation. And he said, oh, it's a challenge. And you could instantly see him going, well, how I like challenges, you know, how can I do this? And what actually happened was that week we talked about it a little bit further, and how might he do it and what might he say? Because what he found was he'd often sit in a team meeting. The coach would say, you know, what do we think about this? In his head, he would answer it, not say anything. Then someone else next to him would say what he was thinking, and the coach would go, yeah, that's right. And he'd go, damn it, should have said something. You know, that I should have said something. So he walked out of the office that day and then came back the next week, and I said, you know, how's your week gone? And he went, Joe, I spoke in the meeting. And I went, oh, how'd that go? And thankfully, whatever he said, it was sensible, because the coach came up to him afterwards and said, that was great that you said something today. That was, you know, I was pleased to see that. I want to see you saying more things. And what I learnt that day actually came from the athlete, because the athlete turned around to me and said, you know what, Joe, from here on in, I don't have difficulties in my life. And I said, well, tell me how you're thinking about that. And he said, well, from here on in, every difficulty is now a challenge, because I like challenges and I'll take it on. And that's the reality of it, isn't it? That if we've got something in front of us, and whether it be a physical thing that we're doing, whether it's a mental thing that we're doing, whether it's a challenge in our relationships or whatever it is. And see, I just, by default, I use that language, don't I? I don't say it's a difficulty in our relationships. Like, but I've had to brainwash myself to do that. Like I have corrected myself over the years, for years and years and years, about, it doesn't have to be difficult. It can be a challenge. And I don't know about those who are listening, but I'd rather do something that's challenging than something that's difficult. It instantly appeals to me.
Well, challenges will be what grows you. I would have had a better question, but I finally got a good look at your husband walking past shirtless behind the windows behind you.
Please tell me he was dressed.
No, he had a towel on.
Oh, did he? Oh, good. Oh, good.
It's a great sight. I sort of wanted to ask you about that particular athlete with, he did stick his mitt up and answer a question. The big part of that I want to ask you is how important was that positive reinforcement, though, from the coach? The coach coming up to him and going, like, let's just call him James, like, hey, James, that was a great question. Good on you for sticking your hand up. How important, as the leader of that situation, that coach, how important was it for him to do that to someone who was obviously struggling with that?
It completely reinforced what he did. So if, what it was the wisdom of the coach to notice that this athlete had done something atypical. This athlete does not normally speak up. This athlete did. And I mean, I still assume to this day that he said something sensible. Maybe it wasn't sensible. For whatever reason, the coach reinforced what he said. And that was incredibly useful for the athlete in terms of building confidence. And I think the thing that we can all take from that as an example is the importance of people in our lives. People matter. Positive psychology has worked out a few things. The way you think matters, and people matter. So the reinforcement that you can give to someone else by acknowledging them, by listening to them, giving them the gift of listening, any of those sorts of things that we do, we all know what it is to feel validated. And I think that that's what that coach did on that day for that athlete, was validated the athlete to the athlete and validated that athlete in front of his peers as well. So it was an incredibly powerful day because, as I said, that athlete came back and said, I'm not having a problem again for the rest of my life from here on in its challenges. And it's interesting because that was a long time ago that happened. And I've stayed in contact with that person who's no longer a professional athlete. But it's interesting to watch his life develop and grow. And, there's a whole range of positive characteristics about him and his mindset and so forth. But that's evident now. Like, he's someone who just embraces life, takes on the challenge, sometimes gets it right, sometimes has a failure, dusts himself off and then keeps going. And he's managed to do that in his career now that he's no longer a professional athlete.
And I think it is very important to, as well, sort of undermine sometimes something negative, but with something positive as well. And the example I give to that is the transition of your training in the army, from my experiences, is massive. The training you get at, your basic training, your employment training, and then actually once you're in your job at a unit, is the way you're treated so much differently. Where, at a basic level, it's, you stuff something up and you fucking idiots, how have you done this? But then one of the best training I've ever got, and you improve so much more this way. That way you don't actually improve with anything because you've never identified what you've done well or what you've done right. You're just a fuckwit. Now, things like that are important in some training scenarios like that. But some of the best I've ever had was actually when I was overseas. I did room entry drills, what is incredibly complex. To enter a room with, say, a section of 4 or 5 blokes into a room safely with combatants or targets at this point is an incredibly complex scenario. Anyway, we were doing it with the 2nd Commando Regiment, and they were watching us do it. Now, we went in and my team completely fucked it. On our first one, we came in and just stuffed it. And they stopped us on the spot. Like, righto, stop where you are. Like, literally halfway through your step, yep, stop there. And I'm like, righto, Jono, Benny, you guys did such a good job entering here. Weapons pointed this way, weapons pointed that. Was fantastic. The way you came in as well as a section, you had good communication. But the where you need to improve is, Willy, you need to come in a bit faster, or you need to move this way. And I think it's important. I think it's almost relevant to that positive reinforcement that sometimes when you do pull up people on things, it is important not to just their shit, is to give, well, you've done this well. Where, and I want to get your opinion on this, but at the end of a footy game, that the way you treat a loss can be just as important of how you treat a win. That, well, you've lost, lads, but yes, but your teamwork and your communication together was so great this game. But it just as important on the flip side is you've won, but yeah, you need to. Yes, you've won. That's fantastic, but you need to improve on your communication and your teamwork. And do you see that as important on both sides of winning and losing things?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I see teams when they win often don't do enough, in my opinion, is they don't spend enough time working out why they won, how they did it. So they, great, we won. And it's interesting, I've often observed the difference for teams in when, teams that formally meet about their performance, and their meetings are often so much quicker after a win than after a loss. It's almost like they gloss over the win, but I think that there again is your recipe for success, isn't it? That if you know what were the elements that contributed to you winning, that's good, because you want to keep doing it. That's what you want to be able to do. And the other point that you made there that's incredibly important as well is how you manage a loss. That you need to be able to say, okay, these were the areas where we fell down, and this is how we're going to make it look better next time. This is where we're going to improve on it. Because and even when I've worked with, really high performing athletes at, Australian level and so forth, it doesn't help to go, you know what, you dropped the ball. And they go, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, I know that. That's the bit I know. Give me some instructional feedback on how I can now do that better. So Joe, I noticed you dropped the ball because it looked to me like you took your eye off it. Like I've given a very basic example there, but Joe, next time you are catching the high ball, remember eyes up, hands together, whatever the instructional things are. So you're actually giving some specific feedback on how to get better, because that's what athletes are often craving, and they often don't get, because perhaps a coach or a teammate is putting their own emotions into the feedback, and they're not actually thinking through what does this person need at this point in time. So you don't want to gloss it over. Like if I'm doing something wrong on the team or for the team, then pull me up on it. Otherwise, I'm going to keep doing it. But give me some help, because particularly if I'm on the field, and I'm keep going with football examples, but if I'm on the field and I've made a mistake, the very easy default position for a human is then to replay it in their heads like it's a video. I drop the ball and I see myself do it over and over and over again. One of the things we know through sports psychology is what you see is what you get. Yeah. So if I repeat the video of stuffing up, then any wonder the next time the high ball comes near me, I'm going to drop it again. So I need to have a strategy there that allows me to go, right, okay, so whatever I just did then didn't work. It wasn't what I wanted. It didn't look the way I wanted it to. So next time I need to visualize what that's going to look like, if I've got the luxury of a little bit of time there in the sport to do it, because what you see is what you get. So you really need to be putting those positive images into your head about what success looks like, and move on. And if I can be take up a bit of time and just give you another example of that I think would resonate for people, is many years ago I worked with a boxer. And I don't profess to know a lot about boxing. I think it was actually the first boxer I'd ever worked with. I've worked with a few, but it was the first one. And one of the issues that he presented with is that at the start of the fight, he was ending up back on the ropes. And I knew enough of boxing that was where he wanted to be. And interestingly, when we dug down into it to find out what was going on, the last thing the trainer would say to him as he stepped into the ring was, stay off the ropes. And of course, then it became, even if you think about that and you think about boxing and someone says to you, stay off the ropes, first thing I see is ropes. So what happens is, what an athlete's got to be able to do when you give an instruction like that is go, okay, I need to stay off the ropes. Right. So I need to do something different. What would be something different? What would that look like? Oh, okay, I probably need to, and the reality is, if I'm about to get punched in the head, I'm not going to think about all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So I said to the trainer, this is probably one of the easiest interventions I ever did. I said to the trainer, okay, so you want him to stay off the ropes. What do you actually want him to do? Knowing full well what the answer was going to be. And he said, he looked at me like I was silly. And he just said, well, I just want him to stay in the center. And I said, okay, say that to him. Yeah. So he would step out. He'd say, stay in the center. And then what do you know? The athlete would stay in the middle, because you didn't have to translate all that negativity and turn it into something positive. Because in sport, in those moments of high exhilaration and all the adrenaline that's going and all the rest of it, don't make it hard for me. Tell me what you want me to do. What's it going to look like? And if you put that image into my head, it makes it much, much easier for me to perform the way that we all want that athlete to do so.
Yeah, for sure. And it almost relates back to the losers have meetings and winners have parties, where it really needs to almost be the opposite way. That balance of life to a degree. And I know you do talk about in the book that balance of life, that it can't be balanced for a professional athlete, that you're looking to do 10,000 hours before you're really good at it. And then I think you give the example of a violinist. By the time they're, playing in an orchestra at a national level, will do 25 to 30,000 hours of training. And that
absolutely, and that other key element there is the importance of that deliberate practice. Because if we all think about ourselves in terms of how long have you been writing for, if I think about handwriting there with a pen and a piece of paper, and let's say we've got, I don't know how many hours we've all got, but you've probably got a decent chunk of them. How perfect is your writing? It's probably the same scrawl it was 10 years ago. I know mine is, so without the intention to improve, we don't. So absolutely, all of that becomes really critical.
And I know one of your favorite things, and I remember this on the last podcast, and it's particularly in your book, is discussing habits and, identifying bad habits you've got and then actually recreating a new habit. And you say, the example you give in your book, and I think we spoke about it last time, was with flossing your teeth. That everyone who's ever been to the dentist, myself included, your dentist will always say you need to floss. And you thinking, well, why don't I? And you're going, well, I reach for this with my right hand and my toothpaste with my left hand, and I do this. It's all a habit. You don't think about it. Although you have made that decision unconsciously in the 100,000 decisions, whatever you do a day, that's an unconscious one. That's a habit. Where if you can incorporate flossing into that habit, you won't even think of it anymore. It doesn't become a chore. And do you have any tips on creating those good habits?
And you're right. Habits. Yeah, habits is one of my favourite topics, because I really think, even though I know I sometimes say to people, well, it's about creating good habits, and people roll their eyes at me and go, oh, this is the boring bit. This is the foundation for success. That success comes from great habits. And you're right, we make so many decisions every single day that really, if we sat down and looked at all of them, would be amazed at how many decisions we've made in the given day, whatever it is, 30 to 40,000 decisions. And the reality is our brain can't cope with all of that. So what it does, because our brain's so clever, is it creates shortcuts for us. So like you say, the act of brushing your teeth, we just say, okay, well, I'm just going to go and brush my teeth. That's one thing I'm going to do. But the reality is in the process of doing that, you're making lots and lots of different decisions, even down to, I'm in a large Queenslander. We've got 3 bathrooms. So it goes from where do you brush your teeth, how do you do it, all those sorts of things. And we don't. What you do is you create habits. And I always say to people, habits are great because they save us from having to think. And I also say habits are terrible because they save us from having to think. Yeah. So if one of your habits is that you get up in the morning and you do some physical activity, say, most people would, give you a tick for that and go, that's probably a good thing to do. Or you get up and you take the dog for a walk, or you get up and you do some meditation, or whatever it is. Yeah. Those sorts of things. We go, yeah, okay, and you just do it every day. That's what you do out of getting up. It's a bit like going to the bathroom, and it's a bit like eating breakfast. Hopefully, we do all those things as well. But what happens is that we get into these habits and we become mindless with them. So I'm a big fan of mindfulness, because I think that's when we pay attention to what we're doing. So I think it's useful for us to think about what are our habits and how are they working for us. So if one of your habits is regular physical activity, great, keep doing it. And if one of your regular habits is, 2 cartons of beer every night and 6 packets of Tim Tams, then, every habit has a consequence. So we need to rethink some of these things. So the flossing your teeth is a good example. I use it all the time. In fact, I'm actually heading off to a dental conference on Saturday because I use the flossing example so often, so they love getting me because I'm the poster girl for flossing as far as they're concerned, because it's interesting. If flossing is something you do, then the first thing I would say to you about that is that makes you very normal, because the majority of the population don't floss their teeth by a dentist would recommend. And it's a bit strange when you think about it, because most of us know it's a good thing for us to do. Most people have a sense that when you floss teeth, it gets rid of all the crap between your teeth, freshens up your gum, all those sorts of things. There's links between our gum health and longevity and a whole range of things. So we all know, like, if you ask most people, is it a good thing to do? Yes. And then you go, great, do you do it? And everyone goes, no. They say yeah because they're lying. About 10% of the population floss like the recommendations that we have. And it's because people will tell you, why don't you do it? I don't think about it. I forget. I mean to. And what you find is that they end up doing it 2 days before they go to the dentist, 2 days after they come back, and then they wait till they go back to the dentist again before they do it. So one of the ways, if you want a little life hack to create better habits for yourself, is first of all, know what the habit is. So let's stick with flossing for now, but let's just say flossing is the thing that you want to do. Because brushing your teeth is such an instinctive thing that you really don't give it a lot of thought, if you can tie in flossing your teeth to something like brushing your teeth, which are obvious things, both happen in the bathroom, then if you can, I guess the phrasing I often give is, if you can piggyback those two things together. So I use a particular phrasing which is called when-then phrasing, and that's become quite well supported in the research as a good way to create good habits. So when I have a toothbrush in my hand, then I reach for the dental floss. And that's the pairing that I make. I piggyback flossing onto the back of brushing my teeth, which is, as I said before, it's an obvious thing to do. What actually happens is that then I go into the bathroom in the morning or into the bathroom at night, and when I pick up the toothbrush, there will be something that will be, kind of tapping me on the shoulder, if you like, or triggering in my brain going, you were going to do, and it actually increases the likelihood of engaging in behavior 2 to 3 times. So we see this all the time, that if there is a new behavior that you're wanting to bring into your life, and maybe it's something like drinking more water. I live in North Queensland, where drinking water is a really helpful thing to do. We need to drink. You might just say, okay, so I'm often getting up at work and walking to the photocopier. So you might say, when I go to the photocopier, then I'll grab my water bottle, and then you find yourself water 10 times a day or whatever it is. So regardless of the behavior, provided it's something that you want to change, you increase the likelihood of behavior change by 2 to 3 times by piggybacking the new habit onto an existing one. And that's essentially what you need to do. Knowledge is not enough. It's not enough to know water is good for me, stretching is good for me, flossing my teeth is good for me, because humans don't necessarily do things because it's good for us. We'll do it because it's habit. And that's one of the best things that you can do. And the interesting thing is, I've now said it enough times, and I'm going to say it one more time. When the toothbrush is in my hand, then I reach for the dental floss. What's going to happen for probably the majority of people listening is that the point that you next go into the bathroom to brush your teeth, then there's going to be something that's going to be annoying you at the back of your mind, and you're going to think about flossing. Now, can I guarantee that everyone listening to the Willy Show is going to floss their teeth? No, I can't, because I don't know whether or not you want to floss your teeth. But what I can do is I can guarantee that you'll think about it. So I think I've spoken to you before about some of the programs that I run in defence. And we run up here at 3rd Brigade, we run some resilience training programs. And I often talk in that very first session about habits. And I always give the flossing example. And I can always remember one of the soldiers coming up to me at the end of the program. It was 6 weeks later. And he said, "Jo, I've thought about you in my bathroom every day for the last 6 weeks," which I can't tell you what my inside voice thought at that point in time. It did fill me with a little bit of horror. I didn't know where he was heading to with it. And he said, "You know what, Jo?" He said, "I have not flossed once." and I said, he was almost saying it to me like a challenge. And I said, "Did you want to floss?" And he went, "Nah." And I said, "Well, you know what?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "I made you think about it." But this doesn't guarantee great habits. This doesn't guarantee you'll drink water. It doesn't guarantee you'll stretch. It doesn't guarantee you'll floss. But if the reason that you're not doing something is because it's not front of mind, this is a great strategy for bringing it to front of mind. And I've used this with athletes wanting to do more practice in their sports. I've used it right across, any kind of health-related behaviour or any kind of achievement-related behaviour. If you can link the new behaviour to something that you're already doing, you drastically increase the likelihood that you're going to think about it, and therefore you increase the likelihood that you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think one of the big habits that's most prevalent in society, you use it in the book, is, and parents actually do it almost instinctively, is putting your seatbelt on as you get in the car. And that habit developing when you're a kid, that you get in the car and your parents, have you got your seatbelt on? Yep. And you develop it that much. You get in the car, you put yourself, you don't even think about it. And you actually don't realize it's a habit until you get in an older car that doesn't have seatbelts. And you find yourself doing this and you're going, what the fuck? Like, and that's when you realize, that's such a habit for me to do. And that's one it's a funny one, that your parents want your kids to do it. And you've built that habit of, well, the car's not moving till you've got your seatbelt on. You close the door and you put your seatbelt on. That eventually, once, they're on the L's and P's and further on, that instinctively the habit of the kids is you get in, put it on, and you don't even think about it.
No, because and you know what, life's too busy to be spending a lot of time thinking about whether or not you're going to put your seatbelt on. You just need to do it. And you're right. And if you were to ask maybe your parents, what were you like at putting your seatbelt on when you were 2? You're probably, we were all probably had to fight our parents and we didn't want to do it and they had to get us to put them on and all the rest of it. But then by the time, my kids are teenagers, I couldn't tell you the last time we had a conversation about putting your seatbelt on. They just do it because that's what happens. When I get in the car, then I put on my seatbelt. And if you start to analyse your life, there's when-thens happening all the time. I get up in the morning early to exercise, so I get up by an alarm. So the when-then for me is when the alarm goes off, then I get up. And I tend not, and there's not too many mornings that I fight it, but other people might have when the alarm goes off, then I hit snooze. When the alarm goes off, then I hit snooze again. So we have these habits in place all of the time. Even in terms of, there'll be somewhere that you typically put your car keys every time you come into the house. And then that's where it throws you out, if you're on the phone or something and you do something out of character. But we have these habits across so many dimensions of our lives. Go into a primary school, watch the kids. I know how it works here in Queensland. Kids cannot go outside without putting a hat on. When they're in prep, the teachers have to say, put your hat on, put your hat on. By grades 4, 5 and 6, they don't, because the kids know when I step outside, then I put a hat on my head. So we create these contingencies. Humans work really well off contingencies, provided we have a motivation to change the behaviour. And that's kind of the crux of it.
And where would you start, though, if you've identified a habit that you don't like or a habit that you want to change? Where do you start about that other than, or is it just you need to instinctively think of it, like cognitively think of it, and that's not what I'm doing this time, and then stop it, and eventually it just becomes a habit? And the example is within the last 12 months in my career in the Army, we've had a change of weapon system. Now, I worked for 4 years on the old version of the Steyr, and has brought in the new variant of the Steyr with the slightly different suite of drills. And I know my habit is, I have a stoppage on the weapon and I do this, and it's not that anymore. How would one like me go about starting to break those old habits, develop the new ones?
You tapped into it before, because you said the first thing with changing a habit is to notice it's a habit in the first place. But it sounds like that's a fairly obvious one to you, because it just doesn't work if you do it the old way. Is that what you're saying? That's how
it does work, but I'm not allowed to do it.
Okay. All right. So
is it I need to identify, like the first stage is, I guess, is it identifying that, okay, this is a habit I want to change, and then it's at each time I go to do it, stopping myself, correcting it, and then continuing how I want to.
Yeah, you have to own it. So if you don't own it, you can't change it. So that is the first thing, is to go, okay, and I guess the motivation that you've been told it must be done differently. So, and I would imagine there's consequences to not doing it, the correct way. So that's sufficient motivation for you to change. And then I think what it is even before you get to the task itself is to go, okay, so now what does it look like? You've got to redefine what it's going to look like. And it becomes a sequence, I would imagine. This is me, I'm talking way outside of my skill set here, but, if it becomes a sequence. So when this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. So you kind of redefining it. And what you'll find is with time and with repetition, it will change pretty quickly. But if you're motivated to make change, and that's where it's always got to start. I always give the example of, picking up wet towels off bedroom floors. My kids don't, there was a time when they didn't used to do that, because we teach people how to treat us. And I taught my kids that if they left wet towels on the bedroom floor, I'd pick them up.
Yeah.
And you know what? I wouldn't pick my towels up either if someone was going to come along and pick them up, even though the towel fairy she was a bit cranky, but, served the purpose. You didn't have to do it. So I tried this strategy on the kids and I said, okay, so when you finish your shower, then you hang your towel up. Perfect. It's going to work beautifully because that's what the science says, or when then I've said it to them, it'll change their behaviour.
Yeah,
it didn't change their behaviour one little bit because they weren't motivated to make it change. Yeah. So what I had to do is I had to put the incentive in there. I had to put the motivation in there for them to want to change it. So a bit like someone saying to you, no, you can't do it the way you used to do it. I said to my kids, do whatever you like with your towels. Knock yourselves out. I don't care. Just know that when there is a wet towel on your bedroom floor and I come through, I'm charging you $1.
Yeah.
Instant success. Well, not instant. Cost one of them $2, cost the other one $4. But, they learnt that there was a consequence to it. So all of a sudden they were motivated. We see that now with the recycle bags in shopping centres. People never used to bring their recycle bags. Now you charge people 15 cents and there's all these people bringing recycle bags. When I get out of the car, then I grab the recycle bags. People will do it now. They'll be compliant because they're motivated to do it. So you have to have insight, you have to have motivation, and then you just need to work out the sequence. Easy.
Yeah, for sure. And probably the last point,
Riley.
Probably the last thing we'll touch on, and I know this is identified, I think, as probably my biggest flaw in my character, is, and I think it's your second last chapter, is called The Pursuit of Happiness, and how that isn't really, it's not a real logical way of looking at things. And I think partially mine is generational, growing up with social media and everything. But I know one of my biggest flaws is that pursuit of happiness. And I'll look at an Instagram and think, I wish I was on that yacht in Greece. Life would be perfect if I was there. Yet they have the exact same physiological, psychological struggles as me. It's just in a different area. And what are your thoughts, sort of around the book for people who haven't read it, on the pursuit of happiness and how that affects you?
Yeah, you've tapped into a great point there, because we know there's plenty of miserable millionaires out there, so sadly for those of us, sadly, for those who think that their life will be better if only they were richer, wealthier, had that job, had that car, had that, personal in their lives or whatever it is. What we know is that we seem to acclimatise in terms of our levels of happiness. And if your belief is that wealth is going to bring you greater happiness, then I hate to burst the bubble on that one. We know that you certainly need to have a certain level of affluence, as in you need to be able to have housing and to be fed and so forth. So we're not saying that you don't need any money. You do need it. But what we know, I think I tend to view it slightly differently, in that what we know is that wealth has a relatively short shelf life in terms of how much happiness it brings us. So there might be something that you want, you've saved up for it for a while, you buy it, you're happy with it, you love it, you enjoyed buying it, you're happy with it for a while, you show it to all your friends, and then after a while, maybe it just becomes that thing in your cupboard or that thing in your driveway or whatever it is, and it doesn't bring us as much joy as it used to. So the things that we purchase for ourselves and the stuff of life, if you like, has a relatively short shelf life in terms of how much happiness it brings you. So what that means then is that you need to have fairly deep pockets if that's how you're going to define your happiness, and you need to have a fairly large house because you're going to need to put a whole heap of crap in it. And we've seen lots of books recently written by people saying, it's all about if it doesn't bring you joy, get rid of it. So if you want to get more bang for your buck in terms of happiness, and if you really want to look at some of the things that really do make a substantive contribution to our happiness and have that longer shelf life, as in they make you feel happier for longer, there's a number of things that contribute to our happiness, our satisfaction, however you might want to define that. But two of the things that I particularly like to focus on, and I have mentioned both of them in the book, and particularly one of them I devoted a whole chapter to it, and I called it the gratitude attitude, because one of the things that we know that most brings us happiness and satisfaction with the world is gratitude, being grateful for the things that we have. Because when you stop and think about it, you said it before, if you stop and think about it, most of us are pretty privileged, that we have a whole range of opportunities in our lives, things that we can do, access to watching sport and having a warm meal and all those sorts of things, somewhere to lay your head at night, all those sorts of things that, when you stop and think about it, we're pretty fortunate. And when we stop and reflect on the things for which we're grateful, that is one of the best predictors of happiness, and we get the longer shelf life from it. So, as a simple activity, stopping and reflecting on a fairly regular basis on the things for which you're grateful is a psychological intervention in your happiness. So if you stop and think about it, and actually some of the research suggests that if you want to time it well, do it as you're going to bed at night. If one of the last things you think about is, it may be what happened today that made you happy? What happened today that made you smile? What can you be grateful for? If you stop and think about those things, there's a level of satisfaction that comes with that that's long-reaching. And in fact, some of the research with people with mild to moderate depression suggests that in and of itself is a very helpful intervention. So all of us can stop and reflect. And you don't have to just do it at night before you go to bed, but, perhaps, you might talk to a loved one in the car and say, tell me something that went well for you today. What are you grateful for? Or you might, as a family, reflect on what are we grateful for. Or you might, and maybe you don't phrase it in those terms, but just stopping to notice, a beautiful sunset or a flower on the path, or the fact that you got through that meeting and no one yelled at you, whatever it is, being grateful for the little things, the big things, is really, really important. And that's one of those key contributors to our overall well-being.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think unless, you have any more burning topics, I think we're basically finished on that. Is there anything else you want to mention about the book? You can give it a little plug, or any other topics you want to speak on that we haven't?
No, I think we've covered it. So we're going to do your chapter separately, or you were going to do that in a separate post?
Chapter. Well, we can go over my chapter. I will do a post as well. For those of you listening, will probably end up here from that post. But Jo did write a lovely bit in her book about me. I'm not even sure where it is anymore. It's near the end. But I guess it was about sort of my outlook on life and how I think you saw it from a psychological point of view, mixed with a bit of personal relation, like we do know each other. I'm just proud that you put me right under Ferris Bueller.
One of my all-time favourites. See, two of my all-time favourites all on the one page.
Yeah, Michael Jordan and Ferris, not me. But you went over sort of, how I get it. And, the chapter's actually called Enjoy the Ride, and it starts, with myself. I actually got the book with me. And I guess the outtake you took from me, in quotation marks, is your age is what you choose to expose yourself to. I like to think that in my 23 years, I've seen and experienced already a full lifetime. Everything from here may as well be bonus time. And I think that relates pretty well, if I say so myself, into your chapter, Enjoy the Ride.
It does. And if I link it back to what I've seen with athletes, which is where the book started, is that those athletes who enjoy the most success, and when I say that, I don't necessarily mean are the best in terms of the athletes, but those who've enjoyed their experience as an athlete, or they found the secrets to what helps them to perform, is that they are able to enjoy what they're doing. That as soon as you take the fun out of it, then it becomes a chore, and it doesn't actually matter what they're paid or any of those sorts of things, that they lose that edge. And for most elite athletes, they didn't start off because they were getting paid big buckets of money. That was just a bonus that along the way. And and I say that with so many elite athletes that aren't paid big buckets of money, and I should definitely acknowledge that as well. But I think what I've seen through them, and certainly my understanding, and I guess I've only known you since your diagnosis and that journey, but your ability to go, but here's a moment, and what can I take from this moment? What can I put back into it? How can I enjoy this experience? That I think that's, the wisdom that you've shared with so many people. And I think that's why, all the chapters I've profiled sort of well-known athletes and so forth, because, my background is as a sports psychologist, and that's what you would expect. And when I came to write that chapter, it was obvious that I would write that about you because, and actually, if I can share with you one quick story that comes off the back of a quote that you once gave, that I haven't told you this story yet, but it's you might remember earlier this year I was speaking at a leadership conference for a group of students, and the podcast was actually played, I think it was the night before your last chemo treatment. And it must have been, because it tied in, because I was listening to the podcast, and the next day I was going back in, day 2, working with these students. And you made this observation in the conversation, and you said that a good day is a good day and a bad day is a good story. Yeah. And that really resonated for me. And then I was thinking about these young people that I was working with who were all sort of 16, 17, and I thought, there's a message I really want to share with them, because they do, that, we want our kids to be more resilient, and we want them to understand that when it all goes pear-shaped, there's something to gain from it. Anyway, so I went in that next day, and you might remember although I know you weren't feeling the best that day, I'd had a photo of you, and I'd put the quote up there, and I'd talked through with the kids about it, and they were, it really resonated for them. And then I got the kids to stand in front of the photo and in front of the screen, and we took a photo of you and all the rest of it. So and it's interesting because I run into a lot of those kids, and they've often said, how's Matt going, and all these sorts of things. But the interesting thing that happened was last school holidays, I took my kids to a high ropes course that was on the Sunshine Coast, and the new business set up there. And I'm pretty good with heights, except this is high. And there were some challenges. I'm going to say they were challenges, but the bloody scary things that my kids put me on. Anyway, so we went through it, and really feeling tested with what was going on. I wasn't loving every moment of it at all. There were moments there where I felt quite scared. And so we got through the first course, and it took sort of 25 minutes. And then we were ready to do the second one. I sort of looked up at the tree, and I was going to go. And my 16-year-old kid had to sit through that session because it was actually at the school that he's at. He said, Mum, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. And I said, I know. And it was interesting because I was telling myself all these shoulds. I should do it. I should do it with the boys. I should show them that, you do things when you're scared and all the rest of it. And he goes, Mum, he said, you don't have to do this because you've already done enough. And he said, so from where I sit, that's a good day. But you could do this with us. And as Matt would tell you, then it's going to be a great story. And I was cursing you at that point in time because I thought you put those words into his mouth. So up the tree I climbed, and I was terrified for another 30 minutes. But it's turned into a good story. So you were correct in that.
On the money, eh? That's the way to. I put anyone who struggles with, going through training or anything in the army, particularly I guess those going through the School of Infantry. Like the School of Infantry is fucking hard. I don't care who you are, but honestly, it's one of the best times in your career too. That so you have bad days, but they're the good stories. They're the ones I sit around with the guys at work going, oh, remember when that bloke did that, or you did this or something, and they're the best stories to come out of it. So at least if you're having a bad day, think, well, the optimism in that is, well, I'm going to at least get a good story. It's going to develop into something.
One day this will be a good story. That's right.
It depends how good it is. Takes how long it takes to blossom into something good. Some I'm still not there with. I'll need more time. But yeah, I think we'll almost finish up there. And look, the book is called The Elite by Dr. Joe Lukins. That's, I guess, subtitled Think Like an Athlete, Succeed Like a Champion. And Joe, plug your book. I really enjoyed it. I've only just finished it today. But of course, give yourself a plug and what people can get out of it.
Oh, thank you. So I guess, so the background to it is it came from my experiences working in sports psychology for about 28 years. So I've been really blessed to work with a whole range of great athletes. And I'm really grateful for that experience. So what I've done is put together what have I learned from athletes, not what I've taught them, but what they've taught me. And I just thought it was a message that I wanted to share with other people. So what I've done and what I've hopefully done is created a book that's digestible. I didn't want to write a textbook. I didn't want to write anything complicated. And in fact, someone I know caught me the other day and he walked up to me and he said, "Joe, chapter 3. And I was racking my brain to think, God, what's chapter 3? And he said, "I'm up to chapter 3. I haven't got to chapter 3 in a book for the last 20 years. He said, "I can read your books." So that was, I thought, yes, that's what I wanted to achieve, because I don't think you need to make this stuff. Yeah, it is. I wanted to write the book that you could lie back in bed at night when you're feeling a bit tired and still get through a few pages and process what's going on. So what I hope it shares is some messages of what I've learned from working with elite athletes, but really to make it about you. So, you could read it just from an interest point of view. You don't have to do anything, but you could also read, different chapters in there, and maybe there's something in there for you that can help you to move your life forward. Maybe there's something you're working your challenges through. You want to learn how to think a bit differently. You just want to, I've embraced each of the concepts around elite athletes that we know, to share some of their stories. Certainly not any clients that I've worked with, that wouldn't be cool, but just public stories that we know there. But each chapter offers some take-home messages about some things that you can think about in terms of your own life if you feel like exploring that. And it's a book that I hope people will gain something from. And I've had everyone from 12-year-olds up reading parts of it, so hopefully there's something in there for everyone. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to come and chat to you about how some of these concepts relate for us and for other people.
Yeah, and I honestly can't thank you enough, honestly, for putting my my little bit in the book. It means a lot to me, and I don't, bloody oath, I don't think I deserve that much credit. I think I'm overcredited for what I do, but honestly, it means so much to me having that in there. It's fantastic, and just as much thanks for you coming on the Willy Show. It's been a fantastic hour and 48-minute chat.
Is that what we've got to? And it got me out of cooking dinner for the kids, so I'm on a double win. So thank you for having me, and it was an honour to include you as part of the book, and I'm very grateful that you were kind enough to let me talk about some of your stuff as well. So so I hope that people have sort of enjoyed the chat that we've had and have gained something from the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you very much, particularly to Dr. John. Thanks everyone who has listened to this, either YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcast, or the podcast app. Whatever the Apple one is, I don't do Apple. I'm in the new age. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and thanks again, Dr. Joe.